We will continue to look at the prophet Elijah, for he was a very bold person and had done some amazing things. Yet James seemed to think that our prayers can be as effective as the prayers of Elijah, as we can read in James chapter 5, verses 16 and 17. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other, that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crop. James makes here a very interesting statement. Elijah was a man like us. To be honest, I don't think we really believe these words, do we now? After all, we may well have prayed that the rain would stop, but that does not mean our prayer was answered at that time. And we certainly have never prayed for the rain to stop for 3 years and then to pray again for the rain to start and for the heavens to respond by pouring out rain. So I think that deep in our hearts, any one of us will think, excuse me, James, Elijah might be like you, but after all, you were the half-brother of Jesus. That made you a special person. But James, you do not know me. I am just an ordinary person. I try to hold on to my faith. And there are many times when I doubt God and struggle with issues in my life. For I know that I am not supposed to behave in the way that I do. And yet I continue to do these very things I'm not supposed to. So how can you possibly tell me that Elijah was just like me? If James could know what we might be thinking, he may well suggest that we study the life of Elijah to see whether or not he was right. So let's do that. As we have already learned from the previous story about Elijah, God had sent Elijah to King Ahab to tell him that there was going to be a drought throughout the land of Israel. God had then sent the prophet to a safe place to protect Elijah from the king's fury. After some time, God had sent the prophet to a widow in Zarephath. And he had told this widow that God would miraculously provide food for her, her son, and for him while the drought would last. And God did exactly what Elijah had promised he would do. This showed that the prophet had great faith, and we may well think that our faith will never match his kind of faith. Moreover, we may well want to say to James, James, have you forgotten what the prophet did next? In case you have forgotten, James, let's remind you of it, for it surely shows the great faith of the prophet. It is the story of the end of the drought. You do remember that story, don't you, James? It began when God sent the prophet back to King Ahab. Yes, it is true. I once again met King Ahab. I met him 3 years ago when I told him that there was going to be a drought for a season. That is exactly what happened. And God told me to go back to him, and this time I was to tell him to gather all the people from Israel at Mount Carmel. I told him as well that he was to gather the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah at the same mountain. Once everyone was gathered, I told the people to get 2 bulls, and these bulls were to be sacrificed. One was to be sacrificed by the prophets of Baal, and one was to be sacrificed by me. I told the prophets of Baal to sacrifice their bull first because there were so many of them. So that's what they did. So they cut the bull into pieces. However, I told them they were to cry out to their God, but they were not to light the fire. So They began to shout to their God from morning till noon. They shouted louder and louder. But their God remained silent. So I told them, shout even louder. Perhaps your God is busy or traveling or sleeping even and need to be awakened. That's what they did. More than that, they began to even slash themselves with swords and spears. Nothing happened. Their God remained silent. When evening came, I began to prepare an altar. I then put wood on it, cut the bull, put the pieces of the bull on top of the altar, and then told the people to pour water over the altar. One time, but 3 times. So the altar was completely drenched. Then I prayed, and this is what I prayed. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And God heard my prayer and answered by sending fire that swallowed up the bull, the stones, the soil, and even the water. The wood, of course, as well. Then the people cried out. They fell on their knees, and they all cried out, "The Lord, He is God." It is clear that the prophets of Baal were false prophets, so I had them killed off. It was then time for the rain to come. So I said to King Ahab, "Please, it is time for you to go home. Get into your carriage, because rain is coming." It is true, there was not a cloud in the sky at that moment, but I began to intercede, for I knew God would send the rain. And I prayed, and I sent my servant to have a look at the sky. He came back the first time and told me, not a cloud in the sky. But I continued. I prayed again, sent him back again. And finally, he saw a little cloud in the sky. Was not much, but sufficient evidence that rain was on its way. By that time, I had sent him back 7 times. Then I knew it was time for me to go home too. So I began to run, and God gave me this great power, so I was able to even outrun King Ahab, who was in his carriage on his way to his palace. It had been quite a day for Elijah. He had shown himself to be a true prophet of God, full of faith and power. Nothing and no one had been able to stand in his way. No doubt he planned to have a good dinner, followed by a good night's sleep. We may well want to say to James, "See, James, how can you compare us to Elijah? Look what that man did in just 1 day. None of us will ever be able to do these things." Surely, James, this must prove to you that you cannot compare any one of us to Elijah. If James were here, he would just smile and tell us to study the next story of Elijah. That story very likely began that same evening, when Elijah was enjoying a good dinner and was about to retire for the night, for he was very tired. And no wonder, it had been a very eventful day. But he had then received a note from the palace, as we can read in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. Now Ahab had told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." King Ahab, at his return to the palace, had told his wife Jezebel everything that had happened. No doubt she had flown into a rage after she had heard that all the prophets of Baal had been killed off, since she was a worshipper of Baal, and it was through her that King Ahab and the people of Israel had begun to worship Baal instead of the God of Israel. And now her prophet had been killed off by the prophet Elijah. It was time for revenge, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. She was going to send a threatening message to this prophet, who dared to do what no man had ever done in this nation, including her own husband: kill off the prophets of Baal. After having sent her message to the prophet, she felt much better and was ready for a good night's sleep. For the next day would be a much better day for her, with the removal of the prophet Elijah. As for Elijah, we would expect him to simply dismiss Queen Jezebel's message as pure nonsense. After all, had he not shown the people, including King Ahab, that the God of Israel was the true God, and that Baal was nothing more than a false god who was not to be feared? It is true, of course, that Elijah had never dealt with Queen Jezebel before, only with her husband King Ahab. But even that should not stop him from realizing that her message was only an empty threat and was nothing to worry about. Or was it? I have been away for a while. In fact, I have been away for over 40 days. I did not plan to go on this trip, but it really happened because I received a message from Queen Jezebel the day after I had all the prophets of Baal killed off. And when I received her message, I did become very afraid. So I had a very restless night, and early in the morning I left home. In fact, I ran for my life. I fled to the desert, and when I got there, I told God I wanted to die. I was so tired, I went to sleep, because what else could I do? But then, while I was sleeping, an angel woke me, and he told me to have something to eat. So I did. I then went back to sleep, because what else is there to do? However, the angel woke me up again and told me to eat some more. So I had a little bit more food, and I must say I felt a little better having eaten more food. I then got up, and that is when I had my 40 days of traveling. By the time I'd finished my traveling, I had arrived at Mount Horeb. That is where I met God. And he spoke to me. And he asked me what I was doing there. To be honest, I didn't know what I was doing there. I only knew that I was the only prophet left in the land, and everyone was out to kill me. So I told God. I have to say, God did not take notice of my complaints. All he did was to tell me where I was to go and what I had to do. And he told me as well that there were 7,000 more people who still worshipped him. I am apparently therefore not the only one in Israel who is obedient to him. The journey Elijah had been on had been of his own choice and was not part of God's plan for him. Therefore, he needed to go back where he had come from and could then fulfill the assignments God had for him. God had not yet finished with him. There was still work for him to do, regardless what the prophet may have thought or wanted. Furthermore, God corrected Elijah by telling him that there were still 7,000 people left in Israel who worshipped him. So what do these chapters tell us about Elijah? They tell us that at times Elijah had great faith, and at such times he displayed great boldness. Yet at other times he displayed great fear, suffered depression, and became even suicidal. What may have been the reasons for his sudden fear, his sudden depression? Let's look at a few reasons. Number one, it could be that as part of his personality, he was possibly inclined to overreact at times to situations, as we have seen him do a few times. Number two, after his victories at Mount Carmel, he may have been very tired that day. His tiredness would not have just been a physical tiredness, but an emotional and mental tiredness. He may well have needed to take some time off. Even prophets of God are still human beings who are in need of sufficient food and rest, like the rest of us. And Elijah may not have realized these things. Number three, the enemy would have been very angry and would have prepared a counterattack. It seems Elijah was not quite prepared for that to happen. Therefore, he was very vulnerable and completely broke down when the counterattack came in the form of a note from Queen Jezebel. Looking at these things, perhaps we can now all agree with the words of James, Elijah was a man like us. For we too, at times, may display great faith and boldness, while at other times we may feel afraid, depressed, and perhaps even get so depressed about life and its challenges that we would rather be in heaven with Jesus than continue on in this life. Like Elijah, we may need to consider that the reasons for our depression, our bouts of fear, may be because, number one, we have a certain personality which might make us inclined to overreact at times. If that is the case, then we need to ask God to help us change in that area. Number two, we must make sure that we take sufficient rest and eat properly. Number three, we must be aware that we too have an enemy who will want to launch a counterattack anytime we have been victorious in our walk with God. Peter says that so clearly in 1 Peter 5 verse 8 and 9. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith. As for the assignments God had for Elijah, we most probably will never be called to stop the rain for 3 years. But like Elijah, we are called to fulfill the assignments God has for us, whatever they may be. And we can trust God to answer our prayers, for as believers, we are righteous in God's eyes because we are clothed with the righteousness of God in Christ, as Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. God made him who had no sin to become sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So, having had a closer look at Elijah's life, I believe we can now at least begin to agree with James that yes, Elijah was just a man like us.